You're not being rejected because you're wrong. You're being rejected because you can't be controlled. That's the part no one says out loud. And maybe you've felt it your entire life, without knowing how to name it. You move slower, you speak with weight. You think in spirals instead of straight lines. And in a world that craves speed, clarity, and clean answers, that makes you look suspicious. You ask questions that drag people into silence. You pause when everyone else is rushing. You notice what others have trained themselves to ignore. And because of that, you've been labeled too much. Too intense, too sensitive, too deep, but here's the truth. It was never about too much. It was about being not programmable. See, modern society doesn't run on truth. It runs on momentum, on surface agreement. On obedience that doesn't ask why. Depth disrupts that real. Depth forces people to feel. It interrupts the script, it slows down the transaction. It makes people aware of what they'd rather leave buried. That's not poetic, that's structural. This world is not optimized for introspection. It's optimized for speed, efficiency, and compliance. Carl Jung didn't use hashtags. He didn't tweet punchlines, but he understood this perfectly. He wrote that when someone refuses to conform to the collective unconscious, when they begin the journey of individuation, they become a disturbance to the group, because they are no longer running on the same operating system. The group senses it not logically, but instinctively, and it responds the way any system does. To an incompatible part, it isolates. It rejects, it labels, not because it hates you, but because it no longer knows where to place you. So if you've ever wondered why you keep getting pushed to the edge, why you feel like you're carrying too much in a world that wants lightness, it's not your fault. You are not failing. You are colliding with a system that was never built to hold you. Because people like you slow questioning. Observant don't strengthen the machine. You slow it down, you expose its cracks. You remind others of what they've buried. And that's threatening, not because you're wrong, but because you're real in a shallow world. Depth becomes a kind of danger. Not through violence, but through quiet elimination. Silence, dismissal, lonely rooms, conversations. That and the moment you start asking real questions, and eventually you begin to wonder, is something wrong with me? No, something is wrong with the system. And you've simply stopped pretending it works. That's why they push you out. That's why they don't hear you. That's why they don't know what to do with you. You're not in the way, you are the pause and the momentum. The weight in the wind, the slow, sharp presence in a world addicted to numbness. And you were never meant to move like the others. You were meant to make them stop. Modern society isn't built to find truth. It's built to keep things running. That's the operating principle: stability, efficiency, uniformity. Truth is messy, depth is unpredictable. People who think too far feel too much, or move against the current. They don't help the system function. They slow it down, they jam the gears. That's why the system doesn't need individuals. It needs units, it needs roles. Not souls, it needs behavior that's easy to model. Easy to market, easy to predict. You were never designed for that. And that's not a compliment. It's a statement of incompatibility. Nietzsche saw this long before we had the words for it. He warned that society doesn't reward morality in any deep or objective sense. What gets rewarded is what keeps the herd intact. He wrote, "Morality is just the herd's strategy for survival. Let that sink in. The system defines good, not as what's just or true or right, but as what's useful for the maintenance of order. So if you follow the rules, keep things simple, make no one uncomfortable, you're good not because you're wise, but because you're convenient. And if you question the rules, why refuse to fake a smile when everything feels hollow? You're labeled dangerous not because you're cruel, but because you threaten the pattern. In that world, depth becomes an error code. Complexity becomes resistance. You, as a person, become a glitch in the simulation. That's what people feel around you, even if they can't name it. You break the spell, you don't say the things they're used to hearing. You don't react the way they expect. You don't perform the way the algorithm prefers. And systems, especially social ones, don't like what they can't model. You see, surface isn't just encouraged in modern culture. It's engineered fast entertainment. Shallow friendships mass-produced meaning. It's not accidental, it's design. Because depth makes people pause. And when people pause, they start thinking. And when they start thinking, they stop complying. That's the real issue. Not that you're wrong, but that you're inconvenient to the flow. You raise friction in places that were built for glide. You bring silence where noise is expected. You bring awareness where autopilot is preferred. So what happens next? The system doesn't argue with you. It doesn't need to. It just nudges you out through disconnection, through disinterest, through 1,000 small cues that say, "You're not one of us," and maybe without realizing, you start to shrink. You start editing your thoughts, diluting your words, making yourself easier to absorb. But even that doesn't work, because no matter how small you try to make yourself, your depth still leaks out in the pauses. You still make people feel things they're not ready to feel. You still disrupt the rhythm with your questions. You still don't fit, and the truth is, you're not supposed to. You were never meant to be optimized. You were meant to be real. And reality, especially unfiltered reality, doesn't always run smoothly, but it wakes people up. And that's what systems fear most. Not rebellion, not noise, but awakening. Shallow systems rely on agreement. Not real agreement, but the appearance of agreement. A quiet nod, a polite smile. A sentence left unchallenged, even when it makes no sense. That's how consensus is built. Not on truth, but on repetition. And people who carry depth, they break that. They ask the questions no one scheduled. Questions that feel like someone just turned on the lights in a room that was better dimmed. Like, why do we work 40 hours a week if no one seems genuinely alive? Why do we celebrate authenticity but punish people who stop pretending? Why does the truth make everyone uncomfortable while lies get applause? These questions don't come from rebellion. They come from consciousness, from someone who can't unsee what they see, from someone whose nervous system refuses to play along. But here's the problem. Those questions aren't just inconvenient. They're destabilizing. Because when one person breaks the rhythm, others start hearing the beat. And the system can't have that. So it doesn't fight you directly. It just marks you too intense. Too serious, too negative. Too sensitive, too much. People start backing away. Not because you hurt them, but because you made them feel something they were working very hard to avoid. You shattered the illusion of collective harmony. Jung had a name for this: the collective unconscious. A field of shared beliefs, behaviors, and assumptions that operate beneath awareness. Most people don't think they participate. They move with the current, speak the right words, laugh at the right jokes. And anyone who breaks from that current, even silently, is felt as a disturbance, not logically, instinctively. You don't even have to say much. Just being fully present, unmasked, unhurried, real, can make a room tense, because without knowing it, you're violating a code everyone else has agreed to obey. You're refusing to perform the ritual of surface, compliance, and when that happens, the group reacts. They don't assassinate you. They isolate you. They don't argue with your truth. They ghost you. They don't tell you you're wrong. They just stop inviting you. Not because you're hostile, but because your presence makes silence uncomfortable. You become the glitch in their emotional equilibrium. a reminder that something deeper exists and that they've abandoned it. So they call you names negative, cold. Too philosophical, too emotional. Contradictory labels all meant to say the same thing. You don't match the script. You're not being silenced by accident. You're being silenced because the system runs on consensus, and depth makes consensus fragile. So instead of dealing with your insight, they push you to the edge. And if you're not careful, you'll start to believe them. You'll start to wonder if you are too much, if maybe you should think less, feel less, speak less. But that's the trap. Because the goal was never to understand you. The goal was to protect the illusion. And once you realize that, you stop shrinking, you stop apologizing for being real. You start seeing the exile not as punishment, but as proof that you've chosen awareness in a world that survives on autopilot. Every system needs control, and in human society, control rarely looks like chains. It looks like language. Language is how norms are built, how reality is shaped, how permission is granted, and how boundaries are enforced. That's why the most dangerous thing in any culture is not rebellion, it's new vocabulary. Because when you change language, you change perception, and when perception shifts, control gets harder. Nietzsche understood this with brutal clarity. He wrote that language is tyrannical. Not by accident, but by design. Words are not neutral, they're tools. And over time they become fences. Fences that shape what can be said, and more importantly, what can't be. You live inside a dictionary you didn't write, a grammar that decides what counts as normal, reasonable, acceptable. And if you start speaking outside that grammar, you're not just seen as strange, you're seen as unintelligible. People don't hear what you're saying. They just register disruption. And disruption always triggers defense. That's what happens to people who think deeply. They stop using the default language because the default language wasn't made for them. They need words that don't exist yet. They carry ideas that don't fit pre-labeled boxes. They speak in paradoxes, they describe emotions with metaphors that make people nervous. They don't speak to win, they speak to reveal. And that makes others deeply uncomfortable. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. People don't fear complexity. They fear what breaks their shared map of reality, and deep thinkers do exactly that. They refuse to play by the script. So what does society do? It doesn't censor them overtly. It just stops understanding them. It calls them confusing, contradictory, hard to follow, pretentious, out of touch. These aren't insults. They're defense mechanisms there. The system's way of protecting itself from a vocabulary that threatens to expand the frame. Carl Jung warned us about this. He wrote, "What is not made conscious will be called fate. And what is not given language will stay buried in the dark." This is why deep thinkers often feel mute in conversations that stay on the surface. It's not that they don't know how to talk. It's that the words around them aren't designed to carry what they're holding. They speak, but it doesn't land. They describe, but it doesn't translate, and eventually they grow quiet, not out of fear, but out of fatigue, because when your inner world can't be mapped by the current vocabulary, you start living as a foreigner inside your own culture. And here's the paradox: the deeper your perception, the harder it is to speak in a language that wasn't made for you. But if you stay silent, you become part of the unconscious mass. That's the trap. Depth demands expression. But expression demands a new language. And new language demands courage. Because systems don't welcome what they can't define. They push it to the margins. They call it noise. They call it nonsense. They call it dangerous, not because it is, but because it speaks from a place they haven't mapped yet, and that's exactly why it matters. Every civilization needs someone to break the pattern. someone to ask the questions that don't have answers, yet someone to disturb the comfort that's become decay. But here's the paradox. The people most needed by a culture are almost always the ones it rejects first. Nietzsche saw this coming long before it became cliché. He wrote the one who creates new values must first destroy old ones, and is therefore seen as a threat. Because that's how the structure reacts, not with curiosity but with resistance. New values don't enter quietly. They arrive like tremors. And systems built on repetition don't welcome tremors. They label them as dangerous, not because they are wrong, but because they signal change. And change, real change, requires the dismantling of what no longer works. Deep thinkers don't just observe what's broken. They carry blueprints for something else. A different rhythm, a different language, a different kind of aliveness. But when that blueprint doesn't match what's already in circulation, it gets treated like a virus. You're not offering insight. You're disrupting consensus. You're not a visionary. You're a problem. That's how it begins. You're not welcomed as a source of renewal. You're framed as a threat to what's been working just fine. Even when it's not, that's the tragedy of transformation. Society demands change, but punishes the ones who initiate it. Not because they're wrong, but because they arrive too soon. And when you arrive too soon, you arrive alone. Carl Jung understood this on the deepest level. He called it the process of individuation, becoming who you truly are, beyond the collective identity you inherited. But individuation comes with a cost. The moment you step out of the collective unconscious, you stop being recognizable, you stop being predictable, you stop being safe, and the group senses that. It tightens, it resists, it expels not with rage, but with distance, not with force. But with exile, you stop getting invited. You stop being understood. You stop being one of us in that exile. That silence can feel like failure. But it's not, it's initiation. The rejection isn't proof that you've lost your way. It's the beginning of finally walking it. It's the test every value creator must face. Can you keep walking without applause? Can you carry truth without permission? Can you become the first of your kind without waiting for others to recognize it? Because if you can, then you're not just waking up, you're becoming the alarm clock. And no one likes the sound at first. So know you're not being pushed away because you have nothing to offer. You're being pushed away because what you carry requires a world that doesn't exist yet, and that world, if it's ever going to happen, starts with your willingness to stand in this one and not flinch. You're not broken. You're early, and early always looks like out of place. Until time catches up. The deepest danger for a deep thinker isn't rejection from the world. It's self-abandonment, because eventually the silence gets to you. The isolation starts to whisper. The exile starts to feel deserved. And you begin to wonder, maybe if I softened my voice, smooth the edges, stayed closer to the surface, maybe they'd let me back in? Not because you need approval, but because the loneliness isn't just external. It gets inside you. Start editing yourself. You shrink your thoughts, you delay your questions. You fake agreement, you perform normal. And slowly you become forgettable. That's the cost of being digestible. You lose your shape in exchange for being tolerated. But what starts as survival can rot into betrayal. Because the more you pretend, the more you lose your place inside yourself. Carl Jung didn't romanticize this. He wrote the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself. Completely not because the truth is ugly, but because it's irreversible. To fully accept who you are, your pace, your perception, your pain is to make peace with being incomprehensible to most people. And that's a lonely kind of liberation. So most don't choose it, they choose masks. They choose templates, they choose to blend. But Nietzsche warned what that does to the soul. He wrote, if you wear a mask long enough, you become nothing but the mask. You hollow out, you don't even have to lie. You just withhold enough truth until nothing real is left. You forget how to speak from the center. You forget what your voice sounds like when it isn't filtered through fear. And eventually, you become fluent in other people's expectations. That's the real loss, not that the world didn't see you, but that you stopped seeing yourself. You stopped holding the line between truth and acceptance, between resonance and conformity. And here's the worst part. No one notices, because the world prefers the quiet version of you. The agreeable version, the manageable version. But deep down, you know what you've done. You feel it in the fatigue, in the numbness, in the constant tension between what you say and what you really mean. You become a stranger wearing your own face. That's not just sad, it's unsustainable. Because there's only so long a soul can live in disguise before it starts to suffocate. So no, you may not be able to change the system. You may not be able to force understanding or demand belonging, but you can choose this. Do not betray yourself. Let the world misunderstand you. Let it mislabel, ignore, reject that's survivable. But living in betrayal of your own perception, your own rhythm, your own reality, that's a depth before death. So protect your depth from the temptation to dilute it. Because once you give that away, nothing you keep will matter. Depth doesn't come from comfort. It doesn't grow in perfect conditions. It's carved by pain, by absence, by things that didn't make sense when they happened, and still don't years later. You didn't choose to feel more. You were forged that way. In moments that cracked something open and never quite closed it back. That's where depth begins. Not in books, not in intellect, but in pain that demanded a different kind of attention. A different kind of seeing. Carl Jung wrote, the wound is sacred. When it becomes the place light enters. He wasn't being poetic, he was stating a process. A law of the psyche, your wound is not your weakness. It's your portal. Because the moment you stop running from it and start listening to it, everything changes. You start seeing what others miss. You hear what others silence. You feel before others even notice. That's not a flaw, that's training. But not everyone survives that training, because it doesn't happen in schools. It happens in solitude and confusion, in nights when nothing made sense, except the ache itself, and then comes the temptation to see your sensitivity as a curse, to wish you could go numb, to envy the simplicity of those who never questioned anything. But that's not your path, that was never your wiring. Nietzsche had a word for this. Amor fati, the love of one's fate. Not the acceptance of it, not the endurance of it, but love, real love. Even for the bruises, even for the breaks, because that's where your insight was born. That's where your discernment took root. That's why you see through things others still worship. And here's the shift. Your wound doesn't just set you apart. It makes you dangerous to illusions, to narratives, to structures that depend on numbness to survive. Because once you've integrated your pain, it can't be used against you. It can't be manipulated. It can't be leveraged to buy your silence. You're no longer ashamed, you're awake. And that makes you the kind of person this world isn't sure what to do with. Because you're not afraid of discomfort. You've made peace with it. You're not looking for safety. You've outgrown it. You're not waiting for permission. You've stopped needing it. And that shift from wounded to integrated is what the system fears most. Not because it understands you, but because it can no longer contain you. You don't believe its myths. You don't buy its values. You don't crave its rewards. Because what you found in your pain was more real than anything it ever offered. So no, your wound is not the problem. It's the source of your power. And when you stop hiding it, you stop apologizing for who you became because of it. That's when your voice sharpens. That's when your presence deepens. That's when your truth becomes unbearable to those still living on the surface. You don't struggle because you're broken. You struggle because you're early. You were born with a code, meant for a world that doesn't exist yet. A nervous system tuned to a future that hasn't arrived. And when you try to fit into the world as it is, you feel like a malfunction, like a glitch, like maybe if you tried a little harder. You could be normal, but you're not here to be normal. You're here to be a threshold, a point of tension, a point of departure, a crack in the pattern. That's why you've never felt fully comfortable in roles, in templates, in environments where truth is measured by conformity. Because your alignment was never with the present. Structure, it's with what comes after it collapses. You don't belong to the machine. You belong to the redesign. And that's not a mistake, that's the assignment. Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Your why isn't comfort, it's not applause. It's not even understanding. It's truth, lived truth, felt truth. The kind of truth that doesn't need to explain itself, because it radiates from every cell of your being. But here's the cost when you live from that place. You lose the crowd, you lose the rhythm. You lose the false safety of being mirrored by the majority, because they're still rehearsing, still waiting for permission, still asking if it's okay to be real, but you stopped waiting. You remembered, that's why. You feel incompatible with the old world, because your soul is synced to a different timeline, one that hasn't rooted yet, but will, and that means your job isn't to assimilate. It's to remain real. When everything around you goes artificial, to remain awake when the culture begs for sedation, to remain whole in a world that profits from fragments. No one's going to give you a certificate for that. There's no medal for being misread, but you don't need recognition. You need resonance, not with the noise around you, but with the voice inside you. And when you follow that voice, no matter how slow, how offbeat, how quiet, you're not just surviving, you're disrupting. You're making space for something else, for someone else, for the kind of human this world desperately needs, but doesn't know how to receive yet. So don't collapse your frequency to fit. Don't cut yourself down to size. Don't rewrite your rhythm to match theirs. You weren't made for repetition. You were made for revolution. And revolution doesn't start in crowds. It starts in the minds of those who refuse to betray their depth just to be seen. Let them say you're difficult. Let them say you're strange. Let them call your path lonely. It is, but it's also true. And nothing else is worth carrying.